Well, Charlie, thank you for an excellent talk as well. And we've got a good time for questions on this panel, so I'd open it up for anyone have any questions on, Earth observation, remote sensing, any of the issues that we've discussed. Dave?
Yeah, Kevin, the FTC report.
I think someone has a microphone for you to speak into.
Yeah, thank you. You're well familiar, everybody on the panel I'm sure is well familiar with the FTC report and recommendations about precise geolocation, and I wonder what some of the thoughts in the panel are about the likely outcome and implications of those recommendations.
Well, Dave, USGIF is proud to be a part of COGO, right, the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations. And we're working through right now an ability to craft a consensus response to that. I think from my perspective, the idea of trying to get some handle on precision geolocation information was right? I mean, if they heard my plea from earlier to try and apply some sort of legal policy framework to this, they would say, hey, we're being responsive. We're trying to deal with this. The challenge, I think, for most of us is that it just seems overly broad, overly generalized, and just seems to, it's sort of a sledgehammer attacking a very delicate problem. So I think the intent, from, again, my personal perspective, the intent is right, the execution is a little bit flawed right now. I think when organizations like COGO and others come online and are able to articulate what's good about that framework and what the challenges are with recommended solutions, we could very well end up ahead of where we are today. But in another case, if that isn't dealt with properly, this can be a massive case of we should have been careful what we wished for.
I agree with Keith. I think it was a step that I'm not surprised that the FTC did. I think that there needs to be a lot of thought into how you define precise geolocation information, because our location is collected in so many different ways, from so many different sensors at all different levels, from government, from industry, from other individuals, and trying to sort of identify all that and regulate all that is going to be a real challenge. I also think that we need to think about, we talked about a little bit here today about sort of public space and privacy in a public space. And I personally have a concern about changing years and years of law here in the United States anyways about what's a reasonable expectation of privacy in a public place. And if you start to change that without understanding what the implications are going to be. There are certainly concerns about how that data was used, but I do think that if we start looking, and the drones are an example of that, if we start looking at trying to restrict because of privacy in a public place, that there are a lot of challenges that we need to sort of understand before we start making it the law here in the U.S. anyways.
May I ask a quick follow-up question about the same report?
Sure.
And just curious, the mention of the geospatial industry was limited to a footnote in that report. And how could that have been, given the kind of economic impact that the Oxera economic impact study revealed and previous economic impact studies had suggested?
I think part of the problem is that people really don't, when they either don't focus on it and think about all of the ways in which it's impacting people, or the data is not widely propagated. It is still a very nascent field, I believe. If you think about just putting a timeline on things, 20 years ago, none of this existed. You didn't have a supercomputer on your belt, and now you do. They can talk to satellites and get email feeds and pull up pictures and video and all these other things. That didn't exist. And so I think that, and I would agree with exactly what Keith said about pulling out a sledgehammer to identify very delicate problems. If those are done in too heavy-handed or intrusive a manner, you can kill off entire industries that would have otherwise possibly developed in a way that you can't yet understand. And I think Google's a perfect example of that. I mean, when we first had search engines, people were like, oh, that's kind of cool. But now there's amazing amounts of data that are flowing through that. So
Yeah, and I think one thing to mention too is that we're not looking at the global picture as well. I think the U.S. has, this study showed that the U.S. has a real competitive edge over companies in other countries because we made such an investment in geospatial early on. So we had, USGS, we had satellites launching all the time. They actually made a pretty interesting graph showing U.S. satellite launches over the last 40 years. And around the 80s or 90s, it starts to dip down, and then China, France, Russia starts to pick right up, and they're now actually surpassing us. And so I think that point of continued investment, not just from the public sector, but companies like Google, academics, nonprofits, Nancy's organization, I think everyone needs to kind of continue the momentum because we'll lose that competitive edge, and the kind of broader economic value that's generated from that investment will be lost.
Dave, I also think that one of the reasons that the geospatial industry was only a footnote in the FTC report, and I do find that troubling because that same report references location information as being sensitive information that needs to be very well protected, and in the privacy parlance, sensitive information is a higher level of scrutiny, and there's greater obligations that go with that. But then they make a general reference to the geospatial industry. I do recall, 2 years ago, trying to work with the geospatial community to get them to think about these privacy issues, and there was a great amount of we want to just stay under the radar. We don't want people to sort of know that we're here, and so we're not going to engage with them. And I thought at the time, and I still think it was a mistake because that was the time to be educating the FTC, who were clearly going to be the regulators here in the United States, on the technology, on its value, to start learning the language that they're speaking, because they speak a very different language than the geospatial community, and to start sort of putting geospatial speak into the privacy speak so that there could be a common dialogue. And that didn't happen, and so when the FTC report came out, there had been all these reports, and some of them were discussed yesterday and today about the Apple cases, and there was concerns about, Google Street View in some cases, and so they just put in location without really giving it thought. So this goes to the point that I think that Keith was said, in his remarks. These issues are out there, and actually Pete Schreiber at Esri gives a talk along this line. The geospatial community doesn't operate in a legal and policy vacuum. The issue is out there, and you're going to move into it, and you can either sort of educate and take a position and start working on it, or you can wait for them to come to you. And because of the way the geospatial industry is fragmented, because of it doesn't speak the same language, it's not being heard in some of the forums where these laws and policies are being developed, at least here in the United States. That's my thought.
I wonder if anybody can comment on that. Just came across this just published this month, let's see, National Strategy for Civil Earth Observations. Says some interesting things like we'll make a plan, but every investment will be for a defined societal benefit. And, is that good, or is that, again, reduce this, let's put them up and see what we can do with it?
Well, I think that particular strategy that you're referencing that was just released last month is really a plan to do a plan. And so there had been an effort underway for quite some time, and we thought that it would be released like a year and a half ago. But I think it's a good start. I think it's unfortunate that it only recognizes the federal agencies, because if we're truly going to have a plan that's responsive to national needs, we need to engage the entire nation. And
as commercial observation after state local.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but that's just my comment on the plan.
I do note, I have not read the report. It was forwarded to me by Mark Brender, who's watching Charlie on live stream. He asked if it was on, it references another report that was going to be included with the president's budget, which I have not seen, and I don't know if anyone else out here has seen that as well. But it does reference that. Are you familiar
And
with?
actually, this came out with the president's budget, actually,
Right.
near the time of the president's budget, so I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
I think that's the next round that they
The
were
next round?
referring to, would probably
Okay.
come out with FY '15.
Peter?
Yeah, I was struck in your comment that, the United States needed to be competitive in the geospatial range and number of satellites being put up. Could this, for everyone on the panel, to reflect a little bit on the tension between the national and the global? To what extent is geospatial data actually becoming sort of like energy, like oil, right? That the prices are balancing out. We talk about energy independence, but it doesn't, we're not subsidizing oil prices here, so that it's a global market. And at the same time, we see countries like China, which want to keep Google out or want to keep all sorts of things out, develop their own native industries in this area, but native industries which want to compete abroad too. So, do you guys have any reflections on the global versus the national?
Yeah, my comment may not be too helpful, but it's just to say that there is that tension, and I think Jonathan Zittrain's talk spoke to that, of this kind of natural tension between something that has, basis in state law and jurisdictions of nations, and something that doesn't, which is the internet. And so that conflict between, a country like India saying, we want you, internet company, to comply with our local laws, where a company like Google is really a global company, and we have assets in various locations, but we don't fit as neatly into that mold. So it's just to say, yes, that is a complicated issue, and I think geospatial isn't really different from a lot of the other issues that we've had around the internet, but there are obviously separate issues related to remote sensing and aerial imagery and a bunch of other kind of geospatial technologies that don't fit cleanly into national jurisdictions. So I don't know if...
Just a couple of thoughts in addition to that. And it's a great question because the world is changing very rapidly. Again, if you just put it on a historical timeline, look back a certain number of years, the only countries that really launched satellites at that time, period, were the U.S. and the USSR, and then Europe did a few. It's shifted dramatically. The next, and there are, I think the number is about, it's between 130 and 160 Earth observation type satellite launches planned in the next, before 2020. So if you could read the Euroconsult reports, that's the data. Now, not all of those are imaging. Some of them are radar and other things like that, so radar-type satellites. But that's an astounding number of satellites. My company, which is the leading U.S. Commercial satellite launch company, has right now probably 3 planned in that same period of time. So peel that back. Germany's planned to launch 3 50-centimeter, 0.5-meter resolution satellites by 2016. India is going to go up with a 30-centimeter satellite. Japan, at least 2, one 40 centimeters, one 50 centimeters, and Israel's planned a 50-centimeter satellite. And we're not counting the Chinese satellites right now because we're not quite sure what the resolution limits are going to be on those. But they have a very aggressive space program. And so the technology advances are happening around the world whether we decide to pay attention to them or not. They're going to be happening. I think, Keith, we've talked about this, but commercially available radar is an example. It's not available in the U.S. anymore from U.S. companies because U.S. companies are not competing in that market. The Europeans have pretty much gobbled that up. And so, go to Astrium to buy those kinds of services if you want to, not from a U.S. industry company. So. I have theories. One is that there may not have been as much of a commercial application as we thought. The second one is that the U.S. government regulated that industry very heavily for a long time, was not obviously able to regulate the French companies. And as a result, the technology went to where the technology was most capable of being free. And so, U.S. company said, well, if we can't do it, why do it at a loss? And the European company said, okay, we'll go do it, and we'll take over that industry. And the Canadians, yeah, I'm sorry.
I would just add one point, and that is one of the purposes or hopeful walkaway items from this conference is this concept of a location-enabled society. If you develop a legal framework that can deal with these issues that have been raised over the past day and a half, the privacy, the licensing, the liability, the ownership, all these issues, you can create societies that enable the use of this information for societal good, economic good, governmental good. But to go to the point, Peter, I think this is related, but that if you don't do that, you're going to be creating sort of a geo divide. You're going to be creating companies or countries and nations or regions that don't use this. They're either too restrictive, they have too many concerns, or they're overly, or they use it in ways that impact civil liberties and freedom, so that people stop using the technology. So it can go either way. So that's why I think it's important to balance. But I do think that you can see countries developing over the next 10 years based on how they're able to resolve some of these issues here.
Well, I think the digital divide is actually, as you pointed out, now cuts both ways. Think of the cities in China that are now spatially enabled thoroughly, right? Which is actually a very important and very popular means of social control in cities, right? It helps them deal with the graffiti, but it also makes sure that there are no demonstrations.
Yeah, it's a tough issue. It's a really tough issue, and I think different cultures are going to, different nations are going to fall down on different sides of the line depending on what their importance are. Yeah.
I think just to back up on that point, to Kevin's second point, I think we were seeing a law, for example, being proposed in Indonesia that I think it was a country that recognized the importance of geospatial data, especially in the realm of disaster relief, and they realized they didn't have a really advanced national survey department. They didn't have really great remote sensing capabilities, and so in a very well-intentioned way, they started kind of going through the process of how to encourage that. So the next time there's a disaster, we can actually know all of the islands in our massive country and to be able to respond as a government to those situations. But some of the components of that law said that geospatial data, could only be stored in Indonesia. It could only be managed by the Indonesian government. If you incorrectly map parts of Indonesia, you could face jail time. So there are a bunch of provisions that would actually have set Indonesia back, and actually kind of breaks the fundamental architecture rather, of how the internet works, which is that we have to have data centers all over the world, and data is stored in many different places, and that if you kind of go against that from a jurisdictional standpoint, you break how the internet works.
There's an interesting quote, and I don't want to put Charlie on the hot spot, but it came out of the article that he had on India and restricting of mappings, and it was I think it was the Surveyor General of India saying that the public can't be trusted to know what should go in the public domain and what shouldn't go in the public domain. And that's a very powerful statement because it sort of impacts a lot of what people have been trying to do here over the past day and a half.
That's the United States government's position too, right? If you think about that in terms of the levels of secrecy and confidentiality for documents and stuff like that, one could very well argue with 1 million people have top-level security clearances, as came up yesterday. The only conclusion you can reach from that is that people with power don't think that the public can decide what should be in the public domain.
Personally, and I don't mean to monopolize, but I know that when I worked for the government and had a security clearance, we used to classify things because it was easier to classify it rather than release it. I mean, just from a procedural standpoint. Well,
I think if you look at, so we have kind of the opposite view at Google, where we can't map countries unless we do rely on people. And it doesn't, when South Sudan was created, I think Lee Schwartz will remember this at State, when it became a country, we didn't have good map data, and we needed to rely on Sudanese refugees that were in the United States that remembered their villages and were able to look at really high quality remote sensing imagery and then say, yes, this is a school, this is a road. and we were able to kind of build a new country that hadn't been mapped before. Iraq is another example. Their maps were based on primarily British, colonial maps, and they hadn't kind of indigenously mapped their own country ever. And it was a blank space. And then we opened up MapMaker, and Iraqi citizens in Iraq and also Iraqi refugees in the US or around the world were able to map their country for the first time. So I think I would say that should be flipped on its head, and we actually have to rely on the public. No, I know you agree. I'm underlining your point.
I guess, Peter, I'd like to go back to your original question and say that from my perspective, depending on where you want to start, if you want to start at the handheld device, or for the purpose of this, we'll start at the satellite. From the satellite to the communications to the processing to the manipulation of that information, the software and the processing power to do it, to moving it to a handheld device, displaying it, integrating it through apps, there has been a tremendous lead in the United States. And the inability to sort of figure this out, and the radar is a great example. So, right, we can acknowledge now publicly that we have classified radar satellites. I couldn't say that a few years ago. But we effectively, right, if you were to go back and look at the policy and licensing, we effectively precluded U.S. industry from doing that for profit. And so the Germans and Italians and the Canadians have those capabilities, as well as the Japanese and others, and we don't, right? And so there is a competitive edge at a time where we're under this great economic pressure. And here we go again, because we can't figure this out. We're going to hamstring all these pieces of this industry to the point where we will have lost our competitive edge. And that is yet another hangover effect from the inability to figure this out.
A couple more minutes. Anyone have any last questions?
I just had a thought, and anybody else on the panel that would like to address it, but the big data analytics of this are fascinating. If you think about the fact that we can, just my little company, tiny little company based in Colorado, can map the Earth, or not map the Earth, but take pictures of the landmass of the Earth over 7 times a year now. So you can take that data, and now the satellites are going up with not just black and white images and not just a color image, but multispectral bands. Mm-hmm. You can start getting data on crops, forests, cities, rooftops, traffic patterns, all of these kinds of things that what that type of data has when it gets into a Google database, or it gets into an insurance company's database, or it gets into a faculty analysis center, is just fascinating. And so just as a sort of a thought, what kind of other things do you see happening with that kind of big data as it becomes available?
I mean, I think it's things like algorithmically tracking deforestation. It's, I think there's environmental benefits. I think there are tons of commercial benefits. There's a company, I think, out of Virginia that looks at satellite imagery to figure out the pitch of roofs for solar installations, and they kind of do that in a pretty big data kind of way. But I think that's the excitement, is that we don't know, and unless we kind of make that data open.
We may never.
Yeah.
Figure, or
That's the key, is making the data open.
And it's, from a policymaker standpoint, it's a scary thing to take that leap, but there are whole companies and industries and livelihoods that are made out of those leaps.
Well, there was a story in Space Daily this week as well about the use of satellite data for development and monitoring development projects. And when you look at the billions and millions of dollars that are invested in development each year, and you think about what kinds of efficiencies or monitoring you might do as to whether those projects are, succeeding or whatnot, that could be a tremendous cost savings.
And I think going beyond machines crunching data, it's also people kind of crowdsourcing and looking at data. So I think the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative project around Sudan, of having interns looking at really fresh satellite imagery of Sudan to be able to spot military activity, and to kind of, again, shine a light on a dark place and say, hey, the North Sudanese are starting to inflict violence, et cetera. That's pretty exciting. And yeah.
I would just add one more, what I think is a really important example. I do a lot of work for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I'm their deputy chair of the Commission on Education and Communication. But we're moving towards, in 2014 is going to be the World Parks Congress, and the importance of protected areas and national parks, and how might we better manage those assets. So I think, again, there's another opportunity for big data to be used globally to
Even
look at
inventorying it.
exactly inventories and management, poaching, illegal logging, all of those things.
One more question in the back.
Thank you. This is more a comment than a question. On the topic of the potential for the uses of big data. And I think that big data and analytics provides the possibility for developing countries to completely leapfrog so many of the mistakes we've made in the Western developed world, the expensive infrastructure that we've built over many, many years, by using these exploding feeds of data that are coming from the satellites, the cell phones, the cars, the navigation devices, and everywhere else.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, very good point. Well, I want to thank the panel, and thanks for the good questions. And I think we've got a break now, and then we've got just a couple, short break, just a 10-minute break, and then we'll back in here and we'll finish up. Thank you.